If you have questions, please feel free to type any questions you have during the talk in the chat at any point. And then we have students, Carrie and Luis and myself actually, who will be monitoring the chat, assembling those questions, and then I will pose them to our speaker on your behalf. So please don't interrupt the speaker. In the event that we don't get to all the questions, we'll share the chat with our speaker so he can follow up with you after the talk. If you have technical issues, please private message Carrie or Luis, who will help try to help you. And then we've scheduled about 45 minutes for the talk and then about 10 to 15 minutes for questions. And lastly, in Arizona, we have the tradition of using the American Sign Language for applause at the end of the talk, which is this. So at the end of the talk or at any other time when you feel like clapping, please turn on your cameras and practice your ASL. So thanks again. And without further ado, I'll hand it over to my colleague, Mike Hammond, so he can introduce our speaker.
So I get to introduce Peredur. So Peredur Webb-Davies. Note about his name. So Davis is Davis, not Davies. Even though it's spelled that way, that's a Welsh thing. He has publications under a previous name, Peredur Davis. So if you were thinking that there were many Peredurs in the world doing linguistics, you'd be wrong, because he's the man, okay? Anyway, he got his BA and his MPhil at Cambridge. He got his PhD at Bangor in 2010. He has been a lecturer and is now a senior lecturer at Bangor. He's written a ton of papers. He's had a ton of grants. In fact, he had a grant jointly with a bunch of us here, which was really fun because it allowed him and his family to visit us and us to visit him. And oh yeah, we did some research too. He has several books. He has a linguistics book, a joint book with Ensley Thomas, Aspects of Bilingualism in English, but the book is in Welsh on Welsh linguistics. He is a Renaissance man, with no equivocation there. He is a linguist, well, yeah, because you know that. He is a singer, quite good at it apparently. He is the author of fiction in English and in Welsh. I've already teased him about the fact that his backdrop reveals much about him, but I'll just add one last little observation that he is frequently interviewed on radio for his knowledge of James Bond. And I'll just say that he is a really good friend, and I'm really happy that he's here, and let's let him talk.
Thank you, Mike, and thank you, Diane. Diolch yn fawr, and thank you to all of you for inviting me here. Tonight it is for me. It's very dark outside the window. It's also Guy Fawkes night or bonfire night, which means there's fireworks outside. So sometimes I just hear explosions outside. So I'm just going to be chill and hope that the world isn't ending. I'm just going to start sharing my screen, if I can find the button. Can you tell me if it is showing in the presentation mode?
You see it in edit mode.
Can you see it in presentation mode now?
Yes.
Okay. Yeah, I'm gonna go. I can't see the video. I mean, I could, but I'm choosing not to. So if anybody wants to shout out at me if something's gone wrong, or if you can't hear my voice, or if you want me to leave, then just use your voice. Okay, so my name is Peredur Webb-Davies, and I'm going to be talking to you today about some research that I've been doing on and off, really. I've been sort of picking at this question on and off for quite a few years now. And it is a research that I published a co-authored paper on last year, I think, technically. And it's a research that combines my interests in bilingualism, which much of my research is on language contact, on Welsh, but also in historical linguistics. Mike did say that I did a BA and MPhil in Cambridge. What he didn't say was that I did it in medieval studies, medieval languages and literatures, including historical Welsh, Old English, and Old Norse, and that kind of thing. So when my colleague came to me a few years ago, quite a long time ago now, and suggested that I look into this, I was keen to do it. So I've given this tantalizing title, The History of the Future, Investigating the Grammaticalization of Welsh Mynd going to. Now, I think that you are a sort of relatively diverse group in terms of your interests and backgrounds. I'm going to assume that you are linguists and that I can talk to you about linguistic stuff. But if there's anything that I haven't made clear, please let me know. By the same token, if I start describing stuff that is really well known to you and is really obvious, maybe just have a little nap, and then you can come back to life once I start saying anything of note. So this is going to be a paper about grammaticalization, about language change, and about this construction going to. The paper is going to be outlined, or my talk is going to be outlined like this. I'll talk about the construction, the Mynd construction in Welsh, and then compare it to other languages. I'll talk about what I aim to do with the research or with the study that I'm talking to you about, and explain how we did it, how I did it. Then I've got a mostly qualitative analysis for you, going through historical data over 500 years mostly, and telling and describing the kind of patterns that we see. I also have some quantitative diachronic analysis, some graphs to show you frequency analyses, although they're a bit more rough and ready than the qualitative stuff. And then I'll give some concluding remarks, and I'd be happy to take your questions afterwards. I'm going to try to stick to time, but I do tend to talk quite a lot, so you might have to scream at me, Diane, if I go past your lunchtime. So Mynd is a construction that means go to. This is the contemporary Welsh form of it. We're talking about mynd being a what's often called a verb noun, but in this case it's a non-finite verb, go, and is a preposition to. And the particular construction that we're looking at, more or less, is a construction that involves a finite verb to be. It isn't be in Welsh, but it's the Welsh equivalent, plus mynd plus e. So what are the different things that you can say with be plus mynd plus e in Welsh? I've divided it into three different functions, which I think are distinct, but there is some overlapping. The first is a simple construction with a noun object, where you have lexical or literal meaning of going to somewhere. So, for example, the next is in a Welsh example, my Mike yn mynd I Sedona. Mike is going to Sedona. So that's the place that he is going to. The motion of the action is represented by the mynd, and the direction of the action is represented by the E too. That's the generic, obvious meaning of this. But there are non-literal functions of mynd E. So you could have mynd E with a non-finite verb complement, and you could say something like, ma Mike yn mynd I checio'r car. Now, this means Mike is going to check the car. Checio here, which is soft mutated, is a non-finite verb in this case, and it's not like the noun Sedona in the first example. And so this, to me, indicates an intention, something that he's going to do, right? So he's going to check the car, and you would guess that that's something that he chooses to do. There's also, and this is where there is some overlapping, a identically constructed construction or usage from a syntactic point of view, I think, which is where you have a non-finite verb, but where the meaning is more clearly to do with the future tense, something that happens in the future, rather than the intent of the actor. So, for example, mae'r car yn mynd I dorri I lawr. The car is going to break down. Here, I have, in this fabricated example, I've used a non-animate or inanimate subject, car. And so the car cannot do anything of its own volition. It is a car. And so we cannot say that the car chooses to break down. So this sentence, I think, can only be interpreted as something that is going to happen at some point after now. So those are the three main meanings, or three main usages that we're going to talk about and circle around in this talk. Now, this tripartite, or at least multi-partite usage of a go verb isn't unique to Welsh. We of course find it in English. So all the examples I showed in the previous slide work, I think, in English in basically the same way. You can correct me if you're wrong. But there are also other languages that do this, quite a few other languages actually. Here are some examples. French, you can say je vais regarder la télé. I am going to watch the TV. Similarly, in Spanish, you can say voy a ver la televisión. In Spanish, I think that's the preposition a. So although French does not have go plus to, Spanish does have a preposition afterwards. I think this is the Irish form, although my Irish is pretty terrible. So I think that but you can do it in Irish, at least in some dialects of Irish, like Connacht Irish, I think. But something like Tom kun fechint ar an telefish, with, again, I'm going to watch the television. And there are other languages that do similar things. So what is happening, and why can we use go to or be go to in these different ways? The usual explanation is that it is an example of grammaticalization, diachronic grammaticalization, so grammaticalization over a period of time, i.e. language change. And in this case, the change is that the verb go to with well, plus a finite form of be moves over time, or changes over time, to be used by speakers of whichever language to express something happening in the future. So what is grammaticalization? So you may know what it is, but if anybody isn't familiar with it, there are different people who probably have slightly different definitions. I'm following the fairly classic definition by Traugott and Koenig, which describe it as the dynamic unidirectional historical process whereby lexical items in the course of time acquire new status as grammatical morphosyntactic forms, and in the process come to code regions that were either not coded before or were coded differently. And I think that's a rather complicated way of saying basically that some kind of lexical unit becomes less lexical and more grammatical over time. I've put more grammatical in quotes because you know, everything is grammatical, I suppose, but what we mean is less literal and more systemic. And grammaticalization doesn't always, but typically does include other linguistic changes that happen to this unit, which might be one or more morphemes. So it often it usually involves some kind of semantic reduction or semantic change. It involves also quite often some kind of phonological and or morphological reduction. Excuse me. So a good example of this is the English gonna, which I'll come back to later, but we have going to becoming reduced to gonna. If you say, I'm gonna visit the shop, you know, I'm gonna visit my friend. And gonna is reduced both phonologically, so it's got fewer sounds, and also morphologically, so it's sort of squashed from two words into one. So grammaticalization is a frequent form of language change that we find in all languages probably, and in all sorts of different parts of grammar. Here are some isolated examples that I kind of like, just to show you what I mean. So the origin of the present day English indefinite article or un, like an orange or a book, comes from the Old English word an, meaning one. So historically, one or an had a literal meaning of one, of the number one, and a thing that there is one of. But over time, as it became used, it probably became associated as more of like a singulative determiner of some kind, and then now has its main function is indefiniteness. Yes, you can only use it with singular nouns, as far as I can remember, but it doesn't really mean one in the literal sense. It means an indefinite thing. And we can see this kind of change of a word for one grammaticalizing to an indefinite article or an article of some kind in lots of other languages as well. And so to clarify, this is grammaticalization because it loses its literal sense. It no longer means just one. It changes and reduces phonologically and morphologically as well. So an becomes right? It's usually just a schwa for most speakers in most dialects of English. French, the negative particle pas in French is a lovely example of grammaticalization. So you use it in constructions to negate the meaning, but it comes from the word pas, or probably pas in Old French, meaning a step. It's cognate with pace, I think. And so originally you would use it literally in a sentence such as je ne marche pas, I do not walk a step. I do not walk a step. But over time that got, I suppose, reanalyzed by speakers of French as just a thing that you use when you're negating something. And so you could now say something like je ne mange pas. Now you cannot interpret that to mean I do not eat a step, hopefully. So that shows that grammaticalization has happened. That is to say that the literal meaning has been lost. And I cannot not give you an example from Welsh. I prevaricated, but I've given you this one. The preposition, complex preposition i fyny, meaning up, at least in some dialects of Welsh, comes from historically i fynydd, with a th at the end, which means to a mountain or to the mountain. And so figuratively, I suppose, if you're going up, you are potentially going up a mountain. And in Wales, if you keep going in towards a mountain, you will go up. And we can tell it's grammaticalized because people saying i fyny, I'm going i fyny, just to mean up, will not be thinking of mountains, probably. Also, there's the phonological loss of th in the end of fyny. But the word mynydd, meaning mountain, persists in the language as the word for mountain, and the sound of that is different, right? That's kept the th. So fyny, up, and mynydd or fynydd, mountain, have essentially split. So you can see how varied, to a certain extent, unpredictable, or and also how long-term and fluid these grammaticalizations are. So various people have tried to have researched into grammaticalization to identify any common processes that we can link the different examples of grammaticalization we see cross-linguistically. There's a paper by Joan Bybee from 2006. She's not the only person to write about this, but as far as I can tell, she's the person to describe it with the label movement path. And this is one example that she has of a diachronic process by which the same pattern of grammaticalization can occur in different languages without it having to be influenced by different languages on each other. So this is called the movement path. And basically the change that we see is a language will have a word, a way of expressing movement towards something or somewhere. Over time, that construction will be extended to also refer to some kind of intention to do something, maybe because if you're moving towards something, then eventually you are going to reach that place or do that thing. And so there is an intention semantically linked to it, or pragmatically maybe. And then eventually that intention will also be spread to be used as a future tense marker. It's not always the go verb, but it is very, very frequently the go verb. And so this path of movement becoming a future tense marker. So in Welsh, this is hypothetically what we would expect, right? So, oh no, sorry, English, sorry, on this slide. So if you imagine at a point in time in the past where going to or go to was only usable in a literal motion sense, to travel in a direction. So for example, it would only have a noun complement, and you would say, I am going to the store to buy beer. And that is happening now, right? I put as we speak, so as we speak right now, I'm going to the store. This is the thing that I'm doing. The thing that I'm doing is going. Note that probably we cannot say gonna the store in this case. You can't say I'm gonna the store. I mean, I'm not a native English speaker, but I believe that's ungrammatical, or at least weird for most speakers. Over time, then, if this were to proceed along the movement path, then we would see something like it then being used with verb complements, not just nouns. So something like, I'm going to buy beer after class, right? So I'm going to do something, but not right now. And there, that is intent. So I'm going to buy beer. I'm going to buy beer as well. So here you can say gonna, I think. So I'm going to buy beer after class is a statement of intent of what you are then later doing. And it's at this point that futurity or futureness starts to be impliable or inferable from the context or from this usage, right? You could say, well, anything that you intend to do will happen in the future, because you cannot intend to do something that you are currently doing. So over time, you would then expect a grammaticalization along this path to make speakers use this kind of construction to express the future, but without intent being encoded in it. So you don't want or choose or plan to do something, right? So something like, I'm going to sober up if I don't have another beer, that is probably in the context of this person who likes beer, isn't something that they choose to do. It is a statement about what will probably happen in the future. Here again, we can say I'm gonna sober up. And if we can remove intent completely from the equation by having, as I showed you in that initial slide, an inanimate, non-human or non-biological subject, then that has to then just indicate future, right? So something like beer is gonna help, probably, means you cannot imagine that beer has thoughts and intentions. You cannot imagine that beer by its own propulsion system is going to move somewhere to do something. So here it has to just mean something that it is doing metaphorically in the future. So that's the movement along the path, right? Or rather, it's the movement verbs being changing and following this path. And the proposals of Bybee and others is that this is some kind of universal pattern, that we could see this happening in different languages. It doesn't necessarily mean that it would happen in every language that has motion verb, because then we would just assume that every language would use motion verbs to indicate futurity, which, as far as I know, does not happen. But it is a semi-predictable process, right? If you see movement, motion verbs like go being used to express intention, then you could guess, well, this looks like it's toddling along the movement path, and eventually speakers will use it to mean future as well. So English has the future usage, obviously. It's been in English for quite a long time. A study by Christian Mayer from 2004, in this case, he does a frequency analysis of quotations from the Oxford English Dictionary to see how frequent going to or be going to is used verbally to express futurity, or at least intention, from the earliest attestation. The earliest attestation he finds is, the earliest plausible one is from 1482. And you get continuous usage of grammaticalized forms from the 1600s-ish, right, from the end of the 1600s. This is the 1482 example. It's in late Middle English or early Modern English, depending on your preferences. This unhappy soul was going to be bracht into hell for to sin on unlawful lusts of her body. And here we can see going to be brought. Now, if she's being brought to hell, it's unlikely it's an intent of something that she wants to do, or something that somebody, that it is intended to do. So it does seem to be a future usage here. Joshua Poole, in a what is essentially a grammar book in 1646, I think, does describe going to in English as a future marker explicitly. I don't think he uses that word, but he does use it to describe future tense. Now, Mayer's analysis finds that although it's existing in English since the 15th century, it doesn't really become highly frequent until the 20th century. Excuse me. And what he sees is a sharp increase, a spike in frequency of going to as a future grammaticalized form from around the beginning of the 20th century. And this is also the time where gonna is first attested, and so there is probably a reason for that, right? If gonna exists, then that means that grammaticalization has maybe been normalized by that point. So I've talked a lot about English. What about Welsh? So firstly, it's not a spoiler to say that grammaticalized future tense usage of mynd in Welsh does exist in today's speech. I went to the Siarad corpus, which is a corpus of conversations between Welsh speakers that I helped collect a few years ago, and I just found the first example which was pretty easy to find. So here we have ma hynny'n mynd I effeithio ar y becws yn Llangefni eto. That's going to affect the bakery in Llangefni, again talking about some kind of a social issue. So here the subject is non-animate, it's just an event, and so that cannot have any intent to do something, right? So it's a pure future usage, and this is perfectly common and normal for Welsh speakers, I would say. If we go completely the other direction, we go back in time as far as we can. I wanted to see at what point we can say that there was no way to use this in Welsh to express the future. So the etymological dictionary, the primary etymological dictionary for Welsh is the Geiriadur Prifysgol Cymru. Now it does have an entry for mynd I with a verb as a complement, but doesn't actually say much about it. And I don't think it even mentions that you can use it for future tense, but then it's like the OED, it's quite an old and in some ways needs updating dictionary. But here is an example from late Middle Welsh from about 1400, which is definitely using mynd I plus a verb, but I think just expresses movement. So it's ar erir erchys I ddifyned I ychwyna plu. The eagle asked her to go to borrow feathers. Now here, the spelling I've kept from the original, so it looks a bit weird if you're not used to Middle Welsh spelling. You'll see there that's myned with an E or with an S, some kind of front vowel. That is the original form of the verb, and it later becomes mynd without the vowel. I could not find any evidence in any research or in any of the texts that I looked at from Middle Welsh or Old Welsh that showed anything approaching a grammaticalized form or sort of pseudo-grammaticalized form of mynd in Welsh. So as far as we can tell, by the end of the Middle Welsh period, mynedi or mynd go to could only be literal movements to go and do something. So the question is, if we can use mynd for future now, but they couldn't in 1400, at what point in the intervening period did it get grammaticalized? And that's one of the aims of today. So I'm going to be trying to answer these aims. Firstly, what is mynd used for in Welsh across its history? I've given you what you can use it, examples of what you can use it for now at the beginning of the talk, but what can we use, what were they using it for at different times across history? At what point can we say that mynd becomes grammaticalized? And then I'm going to try and answer maybe why it was grammaticalized. Finding the reasons for language change can often be quite difficult. And so I'm only going to offer some ideas, and my best idea, I suppose, or least terrible idea. Now, most of what I'm going to be presenting to you today is from a paper that I co-authored with my Bangor colleague, Christopher Shank. It's a Welsh paper. It's published in the Welsh Language Interdisciplinary periodical Gwerddon, and it is a study of mynd from a qualitative point of view. It is it's a corpus linguistic study in the sense that we got all our data from corpora, and we used as many historical corpora, text corpora of Welsh as we could to try and cover as much of the period between the beginning of modern Welsh and today as we could. So modern Welsh is broadly accepted to sort of start sometime in the 16th century. and we call today's Welsh contemporary Welsh usually, but most of these corpora are what we would call early or late modern Welsh or contemporary Welsh. So we got the historical corpus of the Welsh language, which is collected by Igor Mittendorf and David Willis and others. And it used to be online, and I can't remember if you can still access it online, but it covers quite a large period of history, the 1500 through to 1850. And it's 420,000 words, and it involves texts, mostly things like poems and stories and reports and so on, and plays as well from that period. Then we've got a corpus, which is essentially the text of William Morgan's Welsh Bible. This is from 1588. Bishop William Morgan translated and or oversaw the translation of the first complete Bible, Greek and Hebrew Bible, into Welsh, complete here meaning both the New and Old Testament, in 1588, and it is these days considered, and at the time considered, a sort of pinnacle of standard and literary Welsh. That's 750,000 words. Then we've got a corpus of Welsh newspapers spanning the period of the First World War primarily, and that's 21 million words. That is a corpus that was collected by OCR, right, optical character recognition of the texts. Then there's the what is called CEG, Cronfa Electronig o Gymraeg, the electronic corpus of Welsh. This was data. This is written Welsh from various genres. And they are all written, I think, between 1970 and 1993. So we're talking the last quarter of the 20th century. That's 1 million words. And then finally, there's the corpus for the 21st century, which is the Cassis Adelaine corpus. It's 14 million words at the time that I wrote this, but it's kind of ever evolving, because very, very briefly, what it does is you can submit your Welsh texts to be spell checked on a website, and Cassis, a spell checker, will correct it for you. But as part of the agreement for you to submit it to the website, to type it into the page, you have to agree that they then take your text into the corpus. So it's basically a corpus of potentially poorly spelled Welsh, but it is interesting because it reflects, arguably, what people would write before it gets standardized. So we extracted some tokens. I'll tell you more about the numbers later. Tokens from each period or from each corpus, and then they are analyzed manually, by which I mean I went through the tokens, identifying which type of mynd construction they were. And so the tokens included both the mutated and non-mutated tokens, forms of mynd, and the archaic myned and mutated fyned. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to go through some cherry-picked examples from the 500 years of data to give you an idea of what it seems to me is happening at every point or every sort of general period. So first, just to show that there are some non-grammaticalized forms in all the corpora, and that these are actually pretty common in the, very common in the earliest corpora. So here we have something that implies literal movement. So we have a noun complement here, Ynglystil cwrw fynd I ryfel, from 1660-ish, hostage to beer while going to war. So it's not just me who thinks about beer, it's also my 17th century counterpart. You can see here, ryfel, war, is a noun, and so this is just going to do a war. And again, we see this kind of literal movement that we saw in the Middle Welsh example from the 1400s, where you have a non-finite verb following myned I or mynd I, and it just means you're going to perform this action somewhere in a specific place. So, for example, in this 1561 quotation, ag ydw ti yn nawr yn myned I oresgyn yr India fawr, and you are now going to conquer the great India. So presumably you have to travel to India to do your colonial stuff there. Here is a bit from the Bible. Again, this is indicating clear movement and motion, I would say. A fan welodd Saul David yn myned I gyfarfod ar Philistiaid, blah, 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 when Saul saw David going to meet the Philistines. So David is literally traveling to do some Philistine meeting. So here we have literal meaning only, or at least very primarily literal meaning. More interesting are the examples from the earlier corpora, particularly where we see the first hints of progression of a change happening that pushes it along the movement path. So here is the earliest example attestation that I can find in our data, which I think goes a bit beyond literal meaning, although you might disagree. It's from around 1550. Dduw cymer fy mharti, llydd fi rhag mynd I boeni. It's got very strange spelling, but rather typical of early modern Welsh. God, take my side or take my part, stop me from going to worry. Now, arguably, this could be inferred as somebody traveling somewhere or walking to a bedroom to just sit and worry. But by the same token, I think that we could also see some kind of metaphorical going to worry here, which may be a sign of intent, right? I don't want to go to intend to go to worry, kind of thing. Here is another example, which again is tenuous, but not, I think, implausible. This is from the 1588 Bible. Dywedodd Simon Peter wrthynt, rwy fi yn myned I bysgota. Simon Peter said unto them, I'm going to fish. Now, in modern Welsh, if you wanted to say I'm going to fish, that's how you would say it, right? So it's very familiar, I think, to a contemporary Welsh speaker. Whether or not the meaning here is to be interpreted as an intention or as a future, or just as literal, is up for debate. But I think that I would interpret this as showing intention. My intention, says Simon Peter, is to go to fish. So we can see again some the starting along the movement path. Here is another Bible quote. A dywedodd Esau wela fi yn myned I farw. And Esau said in a dramatic fashion, behold, I am going to die. Now, here he is not traveling somewhere to die. He's going to just drop dead imminently, as far as I can remember from the story. In fact, the New International Version of the New Testament translates it as, look, I'm about to die, which gives you a very clear future meaning, I think. And also this kind of, it's not that he's intending to die, because he doesn't want to, as far as I remember. So that, I think, is the closest, that last one, C, is the closest to a clear future meaning, or future meaning of this construction. But they're very infrequent. I had to sort of struggle to find these, and I originally had a longer list, and I kept sort of trimming it as I realized, now that's just literal movement and so on. Usually a synthetic construction of some kind, which means a single verb that's inflected, is used to represent the future. So I've given an example there, again from the Bible. A mi ei dygaf hwynt. Dygaf is a inflected finite form of the word, well, doing probably, but do it. As we go on through the later parts of the historical corpus of Welsh into the 18th century, we see more of this kind of middle ground versions where it's not exactly clear if it's just literal or if there's some kind of intent or future. So here we have from the 1700s, yr oedd rhai ar ôl I cinio yn mynd I ganu a dawnsio. There were some after their dinner going to sing and dance. Now that could be interpreted literally, that I am traveling from this room to that courtyard to sing, but also that it could equally be interpreted as having a future tense or intention. Here is a rather dark passage from a text from the end of the 18th century. The wider context is that it's describing how people are going to take their own lives. And this part says, fel ag mae rhai yn myned I foddi, such as when some are going to drown, and implied drown themselves, right? Now that shows intent, I think, because they intend to drown themselves. Also, it involves motion from one place to another. So in all these examples, I think that we're in a gray area where you could probably rightly say that they're all literal in meaning, but also I think that we could say that there are at least interpretations where it's not just literal. So there are more recent attestations in the data that show what I think is quite clear future usage. And this comes from the beginning of the 20th century onwards. So here we see, for example, the First World War corpus. Mae isio undeb os ydym yn mynd I ennill y rhyfel. We need unity if we're going to win the war. Another example, ai dirwestwyr sy'n mynd I wrthwynebu? Is it teetotalers who are going to object? These are, I don't think that we would interpret movement here as motion, as the first thing that we'd insert with infer the meaning here. We'd probably infer intention or maybe futurity. From the more late 20th century corpus, we have very clear things like dwi'n mynd I gael babi, I'm going to have a baby. Here, it just expresses future. And here, mi oedd rhan fwyaf yn mynd I aros yno. Most of them are going to stay there. And if you're staying, then you're not going. So that cannot literally mean motion, right? So by this point in the 20th century, we can see grammaticalization has occurred. There are quite clear examples of future, or at least strong intention being seen here, because there is no literal motion, or at least it's very hard to interpret these as literally. And you may remember that on the first slide, I said that having an inanimate subject is the best diagnostic for identifying full grammaticalization here. And we get some examples in the later period. The earliest example of this I could find was this one, which is actually from a text called The American. And it's yr arwyddoref y llong yn mynd I hwylio'n ddioed ydyw pan y bydda wedi ei llwytho from 1840. The best sign that a ship is going to sail imminently is when it has been loaded or filled up. And I think here, although a ship cannot move by its own volition, yes, there is movement here, but it does seem here that we have kind of future tense. I think then in the 20th century, in the World War I newspapers, we see here are two examples of very clear future with inanimate subjects. Yn bu arwydd fod addysg yn mynd I wneud camrau breision ymlaen yn y blynyddoedd nesaf, a sign that education is going to make broad steps forward. And then C, gellid meddwl fod pethau'n mynd I wella. It may be believed that things are going to improve. So those, I think, are examples of fully grammaticalized forms because they're inanimate. And so by this point, by apparently maybe end of 19th century, certainly beginning of the 20th century, we see that happening. Now, I've given you a qualitative analysis so far. Christopher Shank and I did do a frequency analysis, but quite a long time ago. This was basically the first thing that we did. We extracted tokens, and then we ran a corpus linguistic frequential analysis, normalizing it. We had 300 tokens from each corpus, and then we divided the historical corpus into different chunks to kind of so that you didn't have one corpus representing like 80% of the time period. We didn't use the 1588 Bible in this analysis because we hadn't thought of it by that point, so we didn't have it. I did a rather rough labeling where I labeled usage as either locative. I can't remember why I used locative, but it to mean movement, right? Going from one place to another, or future. And future here in my labeling means anything that isn't just pure movement. And so, as I say, it's a rough analysis, and there is a reason why I haven't led with this, because I still think that we could kind of tidy this up, but it's been sitting there for 7 years, so I don't know how likely that is. And also, there's no comparison between Mindy and other ways of expressing the future. So to do a good frequential analysis that shows a change in how people say the future or express the future would probably require more than this. But I'm going to show you a graph anyway. This is a frequency per million graph. At the bottom there on the x-axis, you can see the different corpora. HCWL means the historical corpus of the Welsh language, and so we've divided it arbitrarily into kind of 60-year chunks kind of thing. And then you've got the 1914-1918 newspaper corpus. Then you've got the 1970 to 93 corpus, and then you've got the modern spell checking corpus. And on the y-axis, you see the frequency per million of what I described as the future usage of Mindy or Manedi in the older corpora, which means that it wasn't just pure locational usage. So as you can see, the graph is pretty clear that the frequency is not huge in the corpora until we reach the 20th century, at which point by the end of the 20th century, it jumps up. So in the very earliest data, it's 22 tokens per million. By the 21st century data, it's 527 tokens per million. So we can therefore identify, based on this analysis, that the increase and the change was certainly accelerated somehow. It spiked and it increased in frequency in the last century, during the last century. This is a sidebar. I just find it interesting. I mentioned that there's an archaic form of mynd, which is maned, which is the original form. And here the orange line shows all the maned tokens, regardless of what they mean, in the corpora, and the blue line is all the mynd tokens. And we might expect there to be some kind of a situation where maned is common at the start and then becomes less common, and then mindy is in common at the start and then becomes most common. So you just have an X. But you don't really see that. They're both pretty infrequent in early texts, mostly because a different construction is used, a kind of inflected verb is used. But then you see mynd, the blue line, is actually much more common than manedi, the old form, in the 17th century. And then they flip. So in the 1780 to 1850 group, you can see that maned is more common. And then in the 20th century, maned becomes entirely disused and mynd becomes much more frequent. I do have an explanation. My hunch is that in the 19th century, there is maybe a return to archaic spelling. And people sort of start writing Welsh in a way that they don't pronounce it. I don't think that they would say maned with an E in the 19th century, but they did write it a lot like that. So what does all this mean? I think that I've shown evidence that Welsh with Mindy has moved along the movement path. It's gone from being just literal meaning of motion to having a clear meaning of futurity as well as motion, depending on your usage of it. The change has happened between sometime in the 1500s and today, but it was not very common in Welsh until the 20th century, where we see a big spike around, well, during the century, but we see much more in the World War I corpus than we see in other corpora. So it seems to have started accelerating the 20th century. We do find them in the earlier corpora, but they're much harder to find. I think that it just wasn't very common in Welsh until the last century. So one question to finish is, why did it change? Why did that spike happen? Why did grammaticalization start in the first place? Can we answer that? Let's go back to the analysis by Christian Mayer of the equivalence construction in English. He saw that construction apparently was first attested in English in the 15th century, and then saw a spike in the 1900s, almost exactly in 1900. So that's really similar to the Welsh situation, to the Welsh pattern. Do we therefore want to say that the English and the Welsh affected one another, or that there was a directional effect? Or do we need to invoke language contact to explain what's happening in Welsh with Mindy? Or is it a coincidence? I've already mentioned that this construction can be used for futurity in Irish. There's also evidence of it being used in Breton in the same way. So maybe if we can see it in all the Celtic languages, is it a Celtic thing? I don't think that, by the way, but it's reasonable to think that maybe we don't have to say that language contact caused it. But Hein and Kuteva, who've written a lot about grammaticalization in the bilingual context, they propose a contrast between grammaticalization being triggered by language contact, so instigated by essentially transfer from another language of some kind, and accelerating grammaticalization that already kind of exists at a low-lying level in the language through contact with another language that has a similar thing. They do give some examples of the latter, although they do acknowledge, I think, that it's not very easy to find examples of this. But I think that what we have in Welsh is an example of this, of language contact, of contact with English, accelerating the pre-existing but infrequent grammaticalizations of future usage of mynd in Welsh. So my argument is that it is perfectly possible for this, for mynd, for go-to proceed, to start along that movement path as an internal process, you know, just happens as part of this so-called universal pattern. But that when the same thing started to become really frequent in English for whatever reason, it accelerated the same pattern. It accelerated the frequency or increasing frequency of that construction in Welsh, so that by this point it's become the norm, I would say, to express the future. We can see all sorts of evidence of big linguistic changes happening in the 20th century, late 19th century, certainly now, which we could ascribe to big social changes, such as the huge increase in the number of people and the proportion of people who speak English as well as Welsh, right? You lose Welsh monolinguals entirely in the 20th century, about 1961, which means that now every Welsh speaker has intense contact with English in their brain. So to conclude, Welsh has seen a grammaticalization of mynd over time. It's very similar to the same kind of construction change in English, but it's probably not just a case of one language copying the other. It may be more complicated than that, a combination of internal and external factors. I only looked at written Welsh, and of course, when we're looking at historical data, you pretty much can only look at written or reconstructed forms. So how to what extent do these texts represent what people spoke? We don't know. But that is something to consider and to maybe look at in future research. As I said, what I have not done, because it's very arduous, essentially, is to look at all the to count all the tokens of the other ways that people express future, and then compare them with how many tokens there are of people using mynd to express future, and see if those have a pattern where mynd takes over at some point in the 20th century as the predominant way to express future. That's something that would be helpful, although I have not done that yet. And I think that in order to maybe shed more light on the question of whether or not this grammaticalization was accelerated through language contact, we may want to look at the same construction and change in the same construction in other languages, especially perhaps minority languages, which are also in intense contact with majority languages. So that's my research. There are some references. Diolch yn fawr iawn. Thank you.
All right, thank you so much. That was great. You have lots of questions to answer, Peredur, so I'm just gonna jump right in. It will not surprise you that most of them are from Mike, but we're going to take Mike's one at a time so other people get the chance to ask questions as well.
I was gonna say I can hound him privately, so maybe I'll defer to all the other, and just know if yeah, I think that's.
I cannot wait.
All right, so then we'll start with Sylvia. Sylvia, you have a couple questions, but your first one is just sort of Gallic patterns. So I'm hoping that you'll be able to explain what you meant by that.
Yes, and I think that the second one you answered, Peredur. So thank you so much for the talk. Very interesting. So I work on tense and aspect in various languages, including Gallic, and yeah. So I had looked at the going to in Gallic in my dissertation years ago, and then after with Andrew. So yeah, it definitely has grammaticalized in Gallic as well. If you weren't, maybe you have seen the data, but so it's across tenses too. And so that's what I went to ask in Welsh. Can you change the tense of the is it may of the auxiliary, or
yeah? So you can say something like oeddwn i'n mynd I something, which means I was going to blah.
Yeah, Gallic. Yeah, in Gallic you can get it with the the future and with the past and with the future as well. So you can get, something that works better in English with about to, like, I'll be about to leave when you arrive.
Oh, yeah.
So
there's the similar stuff happening in Welsh where prepositions become grammaticalized to represent different aspects, like about and after and so on.
Great. Yeah. That's great. So yeah, I was wondering if it was doing the same thing. So yeah, we end up Andrew and I end up claiming that was aspect in Gallic at least, but it's definitely done the grammaticalization thing there as well.
Yeah, no, I mean the tense and aspect in this case of this construction are maybe not, maybe it's not clearly one or the other. It's kind of a complicated situation. I think that the fact that it's present in all the Celtic languages, as far as I can tell, is maybe a reflex of them all being in contact with majority languages, English in most cases. So I don't know if it is. I would guess that they've all sort of either developed them independently or that they've been influenced by English or French in the case of Breton. But
right.
Yes, my Celtic expertise sort of doesn't go very much beyond Welsh, I'm afraid. So I'd really like to.
Mine doesn't go anywhere beyond bits of Gallic. So you're thanks so much.
Mike, you can't. You're not. It's not ordered. You're out of order.
I had a follow up because one of my questions was actually about the same thing that Sylvia asked. I wonder if I could amplify Sylvia's. So the example, Peredur, you just gave about the past, that's like the one where mynd is still there. What if I had something like SCE aved? That can't be this, can it? Like I was going to, that has to be.
If you use anything except mindy, then you're back to then literal meaning probably. So you could say, I went to drink, but that just means that you went somewhere to drink physically, right?
So it's so the other tenses where you get the future meaning in Welsh are restricted to the case where mynd is not itself inflected.
Correct. It's always this sort of non-inflected and non-final construction with e. It has to have e as well.
Yeah.
Okay. So then, John Powell, I'm looking at one of your first questions. It was about morphosyntactic borrowing in bilingual speakers. Do you want to?
Yeah, and thank you so much for this talk. You largely answered that one, but I'll ask my other one. But I have a couple comments on sort of looking at this very much chicken egg situation of did these grammaticalization processes occur in parallel, independent of one another, in the Celtic languages and the dominant languages in contact, and that's definitely not a trivial question. And I think knowing that Go is like probably the most canonical, probably source for grammaticalization among all of them. Yeah, that's a non-trivial question. So I won't go any further into that. But my other question was, you showed us that sort of the frequency over time of the usage, the specific grammaticalized usage of Mindy, and you show sort of a dip right around sort of the turn of the century, or maybe a bit before that. I know the timeline isn't terribly linear because of the discontinuity of documents. And that if that were indeed the case, that would be a very interesting situation, because usually, with diffusion of grammaticalization, you have a slow start and then an incredibly accelerated diffusion, and then sort of a leveling off, almost the inverse of the curve that you have. But one of my things that I was thinking about as I was looking at that is sort of one of the biggest drops seemed to be around the 19 teens. You had that corpus of newspapers. And so I was wondering, do you think that genre, and by extension prescriptivism in, say, news, might have led to an artificial dip of the use of Mindy in the corpus, that wouldn't it be the case for the colloquial language?
Yeah, so it's a really good question. I think that, like I said, I have a degree of frustration with the fact that we have to depend on written, usually quite prescriptive text to do historical analyses, because we don't necessarily know to what extent this is anything like what they actually used in speech, although there must be some kind of link. I think that in the 19th and early 20th century, that's the period of sort of standardization of Welsh. It's the period of universities teaching Welsh and the increase in literary prestige of Welsh and so on. And so it makes sense for there to be quite prescriptive, archaic forms in that period. I think it's quite salient that you have to go pretty late in the 20th century to see any grammar books which describe Mindy as doing anything except motion. That you don't see it as a description of a way to do the future, even though now it is basically how everybody expresses the future in Welsh, except for a very limited number of verbs, irregular verbs usually. So yeah, I think that maybe you could argue that in the beginning of the 20th century, end of the 19th century, that there was a kind of reversion to wanting to write in a style which was more literary, but I don't think that would have reflected the speech at the time. But who knows?
I think that's definitely that makes a lot of sense to me. And if you look at American newspapers closely, you're not going to even see gonna or even going to, of course, going to as a immediate future, like in the Wall Street Journal or in the New York Times. So I think there's some parallels there too.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Okay, we're a little over time, but I'm going to try to squeeze in some other questions. So
I can hang around, Diane. If anybody else wants to leave to go to have lunch or whatever, that's fine. But I'll struggle on.
Okay. Well, there's just a couple more. Carrie, you had one about distinguishing between modern and contemporary Welsh.
Yeah, I just thought it was striking when you said that, and I just wanted to know if that was an actual meaningful distinction that other linguists who study Welsh make, or if that was just a convenience thing. Do you distinguish between modern and contemporary Welsh? Is that a well-established?
Okay, I think that there probably isn't agreement on this. When I describe the history of Welsh to my students, I kind of looked this up in books a few years ago, and for one thing, the different cutoff points for the different periods of Welsh, there's no agreement on that. So, for example, some people say that Middle Welsh starts in the 12th century. Some say it starts in the 11th. Some say that modern Welsh doesn't come until later, and so on. Usually, the cutoff point the beginning of modern Welsh is given at basically the Welsh Bible, 1588, which is, of course, pretty arbitrary. I think that I have seen other people use contemporary Welsh, but off the top of my head, I can't remember who. So it's quite possible I made it up, but I don't think I did. I think it is useful to contrast it, because if in the same way as you might describe present day English versus modern English, to contrast, J.K. Rowling from William Shakespeare, then that is why I use contemporary Welsh to contrast with Bible Welsh. I would classify contemporary Welsh or present day Welsh as the 21st century, end of 20th century, probably.
Awesome, thank you.
Okie doke. And then we have a question from Johannes about locative Mindy tokens.
Yes, my question was, you had a nice graph saying the Mindys which are not locative going up when we go into the future or to the present tense, but how many other Mindys were in the same time? So what is the proportion of Mindys which are still locative and which are not anymore locative?
I can try and look it up for you. I think that it is, we get quite a lot of locative usage in the entire period. I think, if I remember correctly, I do have a graph somewhere. It's not flat, but it's much less drastic than the other one. So essentially, I think that the pattern is that whilst Mindy in a locative sense is used relatively consistently across history, the future tense, future usage is much more non-consistent. If you want, I can try and find you the information and send it to you and discuss it with you later. But I did look at this afternoon, but I don't want to make up information to give you, I'm afraid, Johannes.
Thanks.
And actually, to help you out with what happens in other languages with going to, Erin McNulty made a comment about the same thing occurring in Manx. Erin, do you want to comment on that? If she's still there.
I did see the comment. Yeah, that's really interesting as well, because I've been given some version of this talk or talking about it for years, as you can guess, and I've learned that it is in Irish, and today I've learned it's in Gaelic and Manx, and I knew that it was in Breton. I think I have spoken to somebody who says it's in Cornish, but that would be the full set.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay. And then Sylvia, did you say that the other question you had was already answered?
Yep.
Okay.
Got that.
All right. Well, then I don't think I've missed any of the others. If I have, shout it out now. All right, then let's thank our speaker again. This is great, Peredur. And you can take a quick peek, Peredur, at the chat, because Erin gave some additional information there where we went on. But
thank you everybody for listening and for indulging me by going a bit over time. And it was
not at all. It was great. So again, thanks to everybody for coming, and thanks most of all to our speaker. And I think